The encounter. It was a warm afternoon when Alicia stepped into the upscale restaurant, its polished marble floors reflecting the soft, ambient lighting overhead. She was exhausted, her shoulders slumped from hours of studying, her mind swirling with the complexities of political science. At 19, she was in her first year of college, still grappling with the weight of expectations that came with both her academic and personal life. She hadn't even wanted to take the course, but her passion for justice had led her to it. She wanted to understand history, its intricacies, its mistakes, its triumphs, not just for the sake of knowledge, but to shape a better world. But today that knowledge had felt heavy and abstract, leaving her with an unsettling sense of uncertainty. Alicia had always been independent. She worked part-time at a local bookstore to support herself, and despite the constant pressures of her rigorous academic schedule, she never let anything keep her from pushing forward. She was accustomed to long days filled with lectures, assignments, and brief moments of respite. Today, however, the exhaustion was palpable. As she walked into the restaurant, she could feel her stomach growling in protest. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the thought of a hearty meal was enough to put a smile on her face. The restaurant, known for its fine dining and elegant ambience, was bustling with activity. Waiters and waitresses moved with swift grace, attending to the well-dressed patrons seated at tables scattered across the spacious room. Alicia walked past tables of laughter and chatter, her heels clicking softly against the stone tiles. She made her way to an empty table near the window, where a view of the city skyline stretched before her. It was a place she would never have considered in the past. Her family was never wealthy enough to dine in such places. But now, as she placed her bag on the chair beside her, she felt a slight sense of belonging, even in this unfamiliar territory. She had been to this restaurant once before, during a special occasion with a close friend. But this time, it was different. Alicia was alone, tired, and craving a break from her otherwise hectic life. She placed her textbooks on the table, their weight a stark reminder of the pressures she faced. Her eyes scanned the menu as she rubbed her temples, trying to ease the tension that had settled there. Before she could even make her selection, a young waitress approached, a warm smile on her face. "Good afternoon, ma'am. What would you like me to get for you today?" Alicia looked up, returning the smile with a quiet one of her own. She had always appreciated the friendly service, especially in such a high-end restaurant. She had a soft spot for the hard-working people who made a living from jobs like these. "I'll have the Italian pasta with beef stew," she said, her voice tired but polite. "And could you make sure the pasta is extra spicy? I need something that'll wake me up." The waitress nodded. "Of course. Anything to drink?" "A glass of red wine, please," Alicia replied, hoping it would help soothe the mental fatigue. As she looked up from the menu to give the waitress a final smile, she noticed a figure settling in at the table opposite hers. He had entered the restaurant with an air of self-assuredness, his tall frame commanding attention. His suit, a sharp navy tailored to perfection, looked like it had been made just for him. The rich scent of an expensive woodsy cologne filled the air around him, a fragrance so distinct it almost seemed to announce his presence before he even spoke. Alicia took in the man's appearance, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, sharp features, and a demeanor that oozed success. His eyes scanned the restaurant, taking note of everyone around him, as if he were accustomed to being the center of attention. He had that certain kind of arrogance, a look that suggested he was used to getting exactly what he wanted without question. At first, Alicia wasn't particularly bothered by his presence. In fact, she had barely noticed him as she continued to place her order. But something about the way he looked at her, briefly, before quickly dismissing her, made her uneasy. It wasn't just that he was staring at her. It was the judgment in his gaze, as if she didn't belong here, as if she were out of place. She immediately shook it off. She had learned long ago not to let other people's judgments define her. Her skin, her background, her story, they were all hers to claim. She glanced back down at her menu, trying to focus on the food she had been longing for all day, but she couldn't help but feel the weight of his gaze on her, even as he settled into his chair. The man made a small gesture to the waitress, who immediately approached his table, her smile faltering for a split second as she noticed Alicia's presence. The man's voice, smooth and laced with authority, rang out. "I'll have the lobster bisque," he ordered, his tone indifferent. "And bring me a glass of your finest champagne." "No, make that too." Alicia's lips tightened into a thin line. There was something about his dismissive tone, something that rubbed her the wrong way. But she didn't allow herself to dwell on it. She had more important things to focus on. As the waitress scurried away, Alicia couldn't help but notice the man's blatant inspection of her. His eyes lingered on her, scanning her from head to toe with a subtle sneer. Alicia could feel his gaze on her skin, on the subtle curl of her hair, on the way she dressed. Simple, comfortable, yet put together. It was the look of someone who thought they were above her, someone who believed his wealth and status made him superior. Alicia took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was stronger than the judgment of one arrogant man. But even as she tried to focus on her meal, she could feel the sting of his condescension. She was no stranger to being judged because of her skin color. It was something she had learned to live with, though it never got easier. It was as if people like him believed that their wealth gave them the right to judge others. Just as Alicia was about to tune out the feeling and focus on the savory thoughts of her meal, the man spoke again, loudly this time, perhaps for her to hear. "You know, it's amazing," he said, leaning back in his chair and addressing his companion across from him. Though Alicia could tell he was looking at her, how these places let anyone in. You'd think they'd have higher standards. It's not often you see people who look, well, out of place. Alicia's heart skipped a beat. He had said it on purpose. He wanted her to hear. Her fingers clenched around the edge of the table, but she kept her composure. Instead of replying, she simply looked at the menu one more time, trying not to let his words get to her. Little did he know, Alicia was far from the helpless, out-of-place person he thought her to be. She wasn't going to be a passive recipient of his arrogance, not today. But the truth was, Alicia had a lesson to teach him. And this lesson wasn't going to be pretty. The lesson begins. Alicia could feel her pulse quicken, but she didn't let it show. Her eyes remained fixed on the menu, her fingers brushing over the printed words without actually registering them. The man's words had struck a chord deep within her, but she had learned long ago that letting people like him get to her was a waste of time. She had bigger goals, bigger dreams, and no time for small-minded people who couldn't see past the surface. Still, she could not shake the feeling that something about this encounter was different. It wasn't just the mockery of her presence. It was the assumption, no, the certainty, that he was somehow better than her. Alicia had grown up in a neighborhood where appearances meant little. Her family had never been rich by any standard, but they had always had enough to get by. And more importantly, they had taught her the value of hard work, integrity, and kindness. Those lessons had shaped her, and though she had faced countless challenges, it was always with the knowledge that who she was on the inside mattered far more than how she looked or how much money she had in the bank. Yet here was this man, radiating wealth, power, and a clear sense of entitlement. He believed that his success, his expensive suit, his designer watch, somehow made him superior. Alicia wanted to laugh. He had no idea who she really was, and he certainly had no idea what she was capable of. Her order arrived a few minutes later, a steaming plate of pasta with beef stew, the spicy aroma filling the air. As the waitress set down her glass of red wine, Alicia offered a small, polite smile, but her mind was still elsewhere, focused on the man who had just insulted her with his veiled comments. She had half a mind to say something to him right then and there, but she didn't want to stoop to his level. Besides, the lesson she had in mind would come later, when he least expected it. As Alicia took a deep breath, savoring the first bite of her food, she noticed the man across the table glaring at her out of the corner of his eye. His expression was one of quiet contempt, his lips pursed in a barely concealed sneer. He had no idea who she was, or what she had overcome. She wondered for a fleeting moment what it must feel like to live in a world where your wealth and status could shield you from the struggles most people faced. Alicia wasn't naive. She knew that people like him rarely had to work for anything, at least not in the same way that she did. Everything was handed to them on a silver platter. She was pulled out of her thoughts when the man spoke again, his voice now louder and more condescending. "Tell me, young lady," he began, addressing her directly for the first time, "do you even know what you're eating? I mean, look at you, so young, so inexperienced. This place isn't for everyone. I've been to the finest restaurants in the world, but I don't think I've ever seen someone like you here before." Alicia set down her fork, her patience thinning. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she remained calm, determined not to let his words control her. Instead, she gave him a smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, a smile that was polite, but held a quiet challenge beneath it. "I think," she said softly, "you might be mistaken. I've been here before, and I know exactly what I'm eating." The man scoffed, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to in such a manner. He looked at her with a raised eyebrow, as though he couldn't fathom how someone like her could be confident enough to stand her ground. "You know what? I'll tell you what I think," he continued, his arrogance growing by the second. "I think you're just some college kid who's pretending to fit in. You don't belong here. People like you, people from your background, don't end up in places like this." He glanced around the room, his voice rising ever so slightly, as if he wanted everyone to hear. "It's cute, really. You think you're someone special, but in the end, you're just a girl with big dreams and no real future." The words hit harder than Alicia had expected. It wasn't the first time she had been belittled, but there was something particularly venomous about his tone, as though he were trying to strip her of everything that had gotten her this far. His words were a direct attack on her worth, her intelligence, and her potential. And the worst part, he thought he was untouchable, that no one would dare challenge him. But Alicia wasn't just anyone. She had spent years learning how to fight back, not with fists or insults, but with the kind of quiet strength that came from knowing her own value. This man didn't realize how wrong he was about her, and he was about to find out. She took another slow breath, placing her napkin down delicately on the table before responding. Her voice was calm, but there was a fire beneath it, a strength that had been quietly building in her ever since the day she had been told she wasn't enough, whether because of her skin color, her background, or her gender. "You're right," she began, her tone soft yet firm. "I'm not from your world, and I'm not trying to be. But that doesn't mean I don't deserve to be here, just as much as you do. I'm here because I've earned it, not because of some privilege I was born into. I didn't inherit my wealth or status, but I do know what it means to work hard for what you want." The man chuckled, clearly amused by her response. "Earned it? Ha! What could a girl like you possibly have earned?" Alicia's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips curving into a faint smile, one that was both knowing and full of purpose. "You'd be surprised," she said. "I've earned the right to sit here, to speak my mind, and to follow my dreams. I've worked 2 jobs to pay for my college education, while people like you just throw money around and forget that there's a world beyond your expensive suits and fancy dinners. I've had to fight for everything I have. And believe me, I'm not going anywhere." The man's smirk faltered for a split second, and in that moment, Alicia saw the crack in his armor. He hadn't expected her to respond this way. He had assumed that, because she was young, because she was a woman of color, she would simply take his insults without a word. But Alicia had spent her life learning how to rise above that kind of thinking. But she wasn't done. "And as for your judgment," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "you can keep it. Because the truth is, I'm going places you'll never be able to go. My worth isn't defined by the way I look, by the color of my skin, or by the money in my bank account. It's defined by who I am, by my character, and by the things I choose to do with my life. So go ahead, keep underestimating me. It'll make it all the sweeter when I prove you wrong." Alicia leaned back in her chair, her heart racing, but her posture calm. She had said what needed to be said, and as the silence hung between them, she could see the flicker of doubt in the man's eyes, the realization that maybe, just maybe, he had underestimated her in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. For the first time since the conversation had started, he fell silent, looking down at his drink as if trying to recalibrate his thoughts. Alicia didn't wait for him to speak again. She returned to her meal, picking up her fork with a renewed sense of peace. She had spoken her truth, and that was all that mattered. But this was just the beginning. Alicia knew that she had a long way to go. This wasn't about proving herself to a man who would probably forget about her in a few hours. It was about proving to herself that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, could diminish her value. Not anymore. She finished her meal in quiet satisfaction, knowing that the lesson she had started to teach him was far from over. Unraveling the mask. The silence between Alicia and the man stretched on, thick and palpable, as she continued to eat her meal, her movements deliberate, calm. She had said her piece, and now all she could do was wait and see how the man would react. His earlier arrogance had faltered for just a moment, but it was hard to know if he truly grasped the weight of what she had said. Most people like him, people who lived their lives cocooned in wealth and privilege, rarely ever faced the reality of those they deemed beneath them. The world Alicia lived in was one of grit, determination, and perseverance, not inherited titles or privilege. She wasn't interested in proving herself to someone who would never understand her struggles. She was interested in proving it to herself. For a long while, the man remained quiet, nursing his drink and glancing at Alicia every so often, though he made no further comments. Alicia pretended to ignore him, though she could feel his gaze, like a heavy weight pressing against her. It wasn't a look of understanding or empathy. It was the look of someone who had been exposed, someone who wasn't used to being challenged in such a way. She didn't mind it. She wasn't seeking his approval. If anything, she hoped he would come to understand, in his own time, that his judgments had been wrong. Alicia was about halfway through her meal when the man stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with an exaggerated noise. He didn't even glance at Alicia as he turned toward the hostess standing at the front of the restaurant. But before he could make his way past her table, he hesitated, almost as though something was pulling at him to say something. He looked back at her, his eyes narrowing, the usual smugness returning to his face. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I get it. You think you've got it all figured out. But don't kid yourself. There are people in this world who make a difference, and then there are people like you. You'll never be more than just a dreamer. And that's all you'll ever be." Alicia paused, her fork hovering midair. She could feel the stir of anger in her chest again, but she pushed it down. His words weren't new to her. People like him had said similar things before, dismissed her dreams, told her she was wasting her time, that she would never succeed because of where she came from. What hurt more than his words, however, was the underlying assumption that he could define her future. But Alicia wasn't about to let him have the last word. She set her fork down gently and looked up at him, locking eyes. "Is that what you think?" she asked, her voice steady, but now filled with the quiet strength that had grown inside her over the course of the conversation. "That I'm just a dreamer? That I'll never amount to anything because of where I come from, or because of how I look?" The man crossed his arms and leaned against the table, his smirk returning. "Isn't that the truth? People like you aren't given the chance to change the world. It's always been that way, and it always will be. Maybe you'll get a few opportunities here and there, but in the end, you'll realize that the system's rigged. No matter how hard you work, people like me will always be at the top, and people like you will always be at the bottom." Alicia looked at him, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't angry anymore. Instead, she felt something else rising inside her, an overwhelming sense of clarity. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who thought like him. It was about the countless people who were told they didn't belong, that their dreams were unrealistic, that they should stay in their lane. Alicia had spent her whole life fighting against that kind of thinking, and she wasn't going to stop now. "No," she said quietly, but firmly. "The truth is, you don't get it. You think people like me don't have a chance, but you're wrong. I don't need your approval or your validation. I don't need your money or your connections. What I have is my education, my passion, my voice, and my ability to make a difference. Those are things you can't buy." The man's expression shifted ever so slightly. The smugness was still there, but now there was something else, something like doubt, or maybe even fear. He couldn't quite figure her out. How could someone like her stand up to him? Someone who had everything at his disposal. "You're just a naive kid," he muttered under his breath, turning to walk away. But Alicia wasn't finished yet. "One last thing," she called after him, her voice carrying a weight that demanded his attention. He paused, his back still turned to her. "You say people like me don't have a chance. You think we're stuck, that we can't rise above the circumstances we were born into. But that's where you're wrong. I know people like me. I know my community, my family, my friends, and the people I've met along the way. And I can tell you this, every single person I know has faced more adversity than you could ever understand, and they're still fighting. They're still pushing forward, no matter how many people like you try to keep them down." He turned slowly, a hint of confusion in his eyes. Alicia could see he was trying to reconcile the person she was showing him with the image he had created in his mind. "People like me," she continued, standing up now, her posture strong and confident. "We don't let the system define us. We don't let people like you tell us what we can and can't do. I'm not here for your approval. I'm here for my future. And I'll make sure I get there, no matter how many people try to stop me. You'll see." The man's face had softened just a fraction, but he didn't respond. He simply stared at her for a long moment before shaking his head slightly, as if trying to rid himself of the unsettling feeling her words had stirred in him. He looked around the restaurant, his gaze lingering on the other diners, and then, without another word, turned and walked toward the exit. Alicia watched him go, her heart still racing, but there was a sense of peace settling in her chest. She had done what she came to do. She had stood up for herself, not because she needed to prove anything to him, but because she needed to prove it to herself. She wasn't just a dreamer. She was someone who was going to make a difference. And if he couldn't see that, then it wasn't her problem. It was his. As the door swung shut behind him, Alicia took a deep breath and returned to her meal. The world hadn't shifted overnight. She wasn't suddenly going to become famous or rich because of her confrontation. But she knew one thing for sure. She had just taken one more step toward the future she wanted. And nothing, not even a man like him, was going to stand in her way. With renewed determination, Alicia finished her meal and paid her bill. The weight that had once pressed on her shoulders now felt lighter, almost non-existent. As she stood up to leave, she glanced back at the restaurant one last time. Knowing that this wouldn't be the last time she would walk into a place like this, and certainly not the last time she would face someone who underestimated her. The journey was just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Alicia felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. A change in perspective. Alicia stepped out of the restaurant, the cool evening air brushing against her face. It was a sharp contrast to the warm, stuffy atmosphere inside, where the tension had clung to her like a second skin. She took a deep breath, allowing the crisp air to fill her lungs, grounding herself in the present moment. The sounds of the city, distant car horns, the rustle of leaves from a nearby tree, felt strangely soothing. The evening was young, and though her encounter in the restaurant had shaken her a little, it had also reminded her of something crucial. She had the power to define her own path. No one else could do that for her. She had been in the business of proving herself her whole life, whether to classmates who underestimated her, or to professors who thought she wasn't cut out for the intensity of college life. But tonight, in that restaurant, She had done more than simply prove her worth to an arrogant stranger. She had reminded herself of her strength, of who she was, and of the dreams that had driven her for so long. As she walked down the sidewalk, her thoughts began to settle. The city's lights flickered in the distance, and she found herself smiling at the prospect of tomorrow. There was still so much work to do, so many lessons to learn, but tonight had shown her that she could stand tall, even in the face of mockery. She had earned her seat at that table, both literally and figuratively. But it wasn't just about winning a verbal confrontation. It was about something deeper, something that had always been there, but had only recently begun to surface. Alicia realized that her response in that moment hadn't been just about the wealthy man's cruelty. It had been about reclaiming her identity in a world that constantly tried to diminish it. And that wasn't something she had ever done before, not in the way she had tonight. As she walked, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her best friend, Mia, who had been trying to get in touch all afternoon. "Hey, how's your day going? You've been quiet. You okay?" Alicia smiled to herself, knowing that Maya would understand exactly what she meant if she shared what had happened. Their friendship had always been built on mutual respect, shared ambitions, and the unspoken understanding that they both had dreams bigger than their circumstances. Mia, too, had always been the kind of person to rise above the judgment of others, even when society didn't give her the opportunity she deserved. They had both come from humble beginnings, and that was something that bonded them in ways that went beyond words. She quickly typed a reply, keeping it short but honest. "Had a weird encounter today with some guy at a restaurant. He tried to put me down because of how I look, but I gave him a piece of my mind. Long story short, I'm good, but just wanted to share. I think I might be figuring out how to stand up for myself more." Her phone buzzed again almost immediately. "You go, girl. Can't wait to hear all the details. I'm so proud of you for speaking up. It's hard, I know, but I'm telling you, you're gonna keep surprising people. And by the way, when you're ready, you've got me and the whole squad ready to back you up. You've got this." Alicia's heart swelled with warmth. She knew that Mia had always been there for her, through thick and thin. Mia was the kind of friend who would drop everything to help her out, and vice versa. That kind of support was rare, and Alicia cherished it. She typed back quickly, a smile playing on her lips. "Thanks, Mia. I needed to hear that. I think I'm starting to believe it myself." After sending the message, Alicia slipped her phone back into her pocket and continued walking, her mind now focused on the bigger picture. Her conversation with the man in the restaurant had been a reminder of how far she had come, but also of how much further she needed to go. He had no idea what she was capable of, just as so many people in her life had once underestimated her. But Alicia was done being underestimated. She had always been a quiet achiever, letting her actions speak louder than her words. Yet, in the past, there had been times when she had felt like she wasn't enough, when she had questioned her place in the world, when people told her to stay in her lane, to stick to what was familiar, to never aim too high. She had listened. But that was before she had truly found her voice. And now her voice was louder than ever. That night, as she returned to her small apartment near campus, Alicia reflected on what had happened in the restaurant. She hadn't expected such an encounter, but in hindsight, she realized that it wasn't just some chance meeting. It was a turning point. It wasn't about him. It was about her. It was about how she had responded, how she had chosen to take control of the narrative. She didn't let him define her, nor would she let anyone else from now on. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that this moment was a catalyst for something bigger. It wasn't just the confrontation with a wealthy man in a fancy restaurant. It was part of a larger journey she had been on her whole life. Alicia had always believed in the power of education, in the idea that knowledge could change the world. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. You also had to believe in yourself and be willing to challenge the systems that kept people like her in the shadows. Her thoughts shifted to her studies. Alicia had always been drawn to political science, to the study of power and inequality, because it was the lens through which she could better understand the world. It was the place where she could see the connections between her own struggles and those of others, where she could make sense of the injustices that she saw on a daily basis. But beyond just understanding the world, Alicia wanted to change it. She didn't want to be another passive observer. She wanted to be part of the solution. She wanted to use her education, her voice, and her story to make a real difference. She glanced at the pile of textbooks on her desk as she entered her apartment. They sat there, reminders of the work still ahead, but for the first time in a while, Alicia didn't feel daunted by them. She felt ready. As she sat down at her desk, opening her laptop to begin the night's assignments, a new sense of purpose filled her. The words of the man at the restaurant still echoed in her mind, but now they felt hollow, meaningless. His words were born from ignorance and privilege, but they would never define her. She was determined to do something with the fire he had unwittingly ignited in her. She was going to show him, and everyone else, what it meant to truly rise above the limitations others try to impose. Alicia wasn't just going to survive in a world that told her she didn't belong. She was going to thrive. She opened her political science textbook, flipping through the pages with a new sense of determination. The road ahead was long, and the world was filled with people who would try to hold her back. But Alicia knew something they didn't. The strength she had within her was far greater than any external obstacle. The only thing that mattered now was how far she was willing to push herself, and how high she was willing to aim. As she began to write, the words flowed effortlessly, no longer a reflection of her exhaustion or doubt, but of the confidence she was now building. The foundation of her future was being laid, and every word, every step, every challenge she faced would bring her closer to her goal. Tomorrow, she would wake up and face the world with the same courage she had discovered within herself tonight. And in the days, months, and years ahead, Alicia would continue to rise, no longer just a dreamer, but a force to be reckoned with. Breaking through the barrier. The days that followed Alicia's encounter with the arrogant man in the restaurant felt almost surreal. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something had shifted within her, like a veil had lifted, revealing a world of endless possibilities. She was still the same Alicia, still a college student juggling assignments, working part-time, and trying to figure out how to balance everything. But now there was a quiet power in her every step. She had always known she was capable of achieving big things, but now she knew, deep in her bones, that nothing could stand in her way. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Alicia had her first real taste of this newfound clarity. She was sitting in the university library, reviewing a stack of notes for an upcoming exam on American political history. The shelves around her were lined with textbooks and journals, each one brimming with knowledge and the potential to change the world. Alicia had always found comfort in books. There was something grounding about them, about the way they held so many voices from so many different eras, all bound together in one place. Her mind was focused, and she could feel the gears turning inside her head. As she scribbled down a few more notes, the library door opened, and a familiar voice broke through the silence. "Hey, Alicia." It was Sarah, one of her classmates from political science. Sarah was a quiet, thoughtful girl who Alicia had bonded with over their shared passion for social justice. Sarah had always been kind to Alicia, but the truth was, she hadn't really noticed her much in the past. She was always so caught up in her own thoughts, in her own drive, that she often didn't see the people who were quietly working alongside her. But that had changed in the past few weeks. Something in Alicia had shifted, and she was beginning to recognize the strength in the people around her, even if they hadn't yet realized it in themselves. "Hey, Sarah, what's up?" Alicia smiled, motioning to the empty seat across from her. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" Sarah asked, already sliding into the chair without waiting for an answer. "I just wanted to catch up on the readings for the exam next week. I'm struggling a bit with the whole concept of federalism and how it ties into our modern political system. You're always so organized with your notes. Mind helping me out?" Alicia blinked in surprise. She had no idea that Sarah was struggling. In fact, Sarah always seemed so confident in class. Alicia realized then that everyone had their own battles, their own insecurities. No one had it all figured out, no matter how it might seem on the surface. She had spent so much time comparing herself to others, wondering if she was good enough. But now she understood that everyone was just trying to navigate this maze called life. "Of course, I'd love to help," Alicia said, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. She shuffled her notes and pulled out a few key pages that she thought would help Sarah understand the concept better. The two of them spent the next hour discussing the intricacies of federalism, breaking it down into manageable chunks of information, until Sarah's confusion had melted away and a genuine understanding began to take its place. "I don't know what I would have done without you," Sarah said, flashing a grateful smile. "You've really got a gift for explaining things." Alicia felt a wave of pride wash over her. Helping Sarah felt different from the times before when she had simply tutored classmates because it was expected. Now it felt purposeful, like she was giving a piece of herself, not just her knowledge. This was what it meant to share in the struggles of others, to lift someone up instead of trying to measure yourself against them. This was the kind of leadership she had been seeking for so long, though she had never really put a name to it until now. "No problem," Alicia replied with a grin. "I think we're all in this together, right?" As they wrapped up their study session, Sarah gave Alicia a curious look, her eyes softening with an understanding that Alicia hadn't expected. "Hey, can I ask you something personal?" Sarah hesitated before continuing, clearly trying to find the right words. "I know you're always so focused on your work, but do you ever feel like you don't belong here? Like the world is just set up for people who have everything handed to them, and people like us are just fighting to be noticed?" Alicia felt her heart skip a beat. Sarah's question cut straight to the core, and for a moment, Alicia wasn't sure how to respond. She had been so caught up in her own internal journey that she hadn't realized how many people around her were struggling with the same feelings of inadequacy, like they were invisible to the system that was supposed to uplift them. "I used to feel that way a lot," Alicia said after a long pause, her voice quiet but resolute. "Like I didn't belong. Like no matter how hard I worked, I would always be fighting an uphill battle. But something changed recently. I realized that maybe the system isn't broken, maybe it's just not built for people like us. And that's okay. We don't have to fit into it. We can break through it instead." Sarah stared at Alicia for a moment, as if she was seeing her for the first time. Then her lips parted into a slow smile, as though Alicia had given her a piece of wisdom she hadn't known she needed. "I don't think I've ever heard you say something like that before," Sarah murmured. "You're right. It's not about fitting into the system. It's about building our own." "Thanks for that, Alicia." Alicia nodded, feeling the weight of her own words settle inside her. She had said it for Sarah's benefit, but in truth, she had needed to hear it herself. She had spent so much of her life trying to fit into a system that wasn't designed for her, that when she finally realized she didn't need to play by its rules, something inside her clicked into place. She didn't have to ask for permission to exist in spaces that didn't want her. She was already worthy of those spaces, and she was going to carve her own path, no matter what. The bell above the library door jingled as another student walked in, and Sarah stood up, gathering her things. "I'm really glad we talked," she said, her tone warm with gratitude. "I'll see you in class." "Definitely," Alicia replied with a nod, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever challenge lay ahead. As Sarah left the library, Alicia found herself alone again, but not in the same way she had felt before. Before, there had always been this sense of isolation, of being an outsider. But now, she understood that she wasn't alone in her struggles, and she wasn't the only one who had to fight for a place in the world. There were others out there, quiet warriors, just like her, who were seeking the same thing. A chance to be seen, to be heard, to make their mark on the world. Her phone buzzed again, this time A message from Mia. I'm really proud of you, Alicia. I can feel something changing in you. I know you're going to make a huge impact on this world. Keep going. Keep pushing. You're meant for greatness. Alicia stared at the screen, her heart swelling. She had always known Mia believed in her, but hearing it aloud, especially now, felt like a confirmation of everything she had been working toward. She wasn't just dreaming anymore. She was doing, and she was going to keep doing, no matter how tough the road got. As the library lights dimmed and the hum of the evening crowd grew quieter, Alicia closed her laptop and gathered her things. She had work to do, more studying, more research, more steps toward the future she was carving for herself. But she felt a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. No matter what barriers life threw in her way, Alicia was going to break through them. And this was just the beginning. The rising tide. Weeks passed in a blur, each day an amalgamation of study sessions, research papers, and late-night debates with professors and classmates. Alicia's life was nothing short of chaotic, yet it felt like she was walking with a sense of purpose she hadn't known before. The fire ignited in her that night at the restaurant had only grown brighter, and with it, an unwavering belief that she could shape her destiny. As the semester wore on, Alicia found herself becoming more than just a student. She was becoming a leader, a voice for those who often went unheard. The confidence she had started to develop was slowly transforming into something more. It wasn't just about proving her worth to others. It was about showing herself that she had the strength to do what others thought was impossible. It was during the midterm exams, right in the middle of the whirlwind of papers and projects, that Alicia had the first real test of her newfound mindset. Her political science professor, Dr. Hayes, had assigned a group project that was supposed to examine the intersection of race, class, and politics in modern America. The project was to be presented to the class at the end of the semester, and it required not only research, but the ability to challenge preconceived notions, to engage in tough, uncomfortable conversations. The first group meeting took place in the library, and Alicia walked in to find the rest of her group already seated around the table. There was Jake, a tall, quiet guy who always sat in the back of the room in class, and Mia, who had become her closest friend and confidant on campus. Mia smiled as Alicia walked in and sat down beside her. "So, we're in this together, huh?" Maya asked, nudging Alicia with her elbow. "This is gonna be good. We've got this." Alicia smiled, appreciating Maya's optimism. "Yeah, we do. But we have to make this count. Dr. Hayes won't accept anything less than groundbreaking. This is our chance to make a real impact." "No pressure," she added with a wry grin. The rest of the group, though well-meaning, seemed a little less invested in the project than Alicia had hoped. Jake, for one, seemed disinterested, occasionally glancing at his phone or staring off into space. The other members of the group, who hadn't said much in the beginning, were now talking about anything other than the project: plans for spring break, weekend parties, and gossip about other students. Alicia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew she couldn't just let this project slip into mediocrity. She had to make it count, not just for herself, but for the people whose voices often went unrepresented. She had done enough research on the topic to know that this wasn't just an academic exercise for her. It was personal. It was about people who lived in neighborhoods like hers, about the struggles of the working class, and about dismantling the structures of inequality that kept them trapped. "Guys," Alicia said, her voice firm but calm, "we can't just slap something together for this project. We need to approach it with the seriousness it deserves. This is about more than just grades. It's about making a statement, starting a conversation." Jake looked up from his phone, his expression almost amused. "What do you mean, make a statement? It's just a paper, Alicia. Why are you getting so worked up over it?" Alicia's pulse quickened, but she held her ground. She wasn't about to back down. "Because it's not just a paper. It's about using the platform. We have to say something that matters. We have a responsibility to bring a real perspective to this project. We need to talk about the history of oppression in this country, the ongoing effects of systemic racism, and how class plays into all of it. Mia, who had been listening quietly, nodded in agreement. Alicia's right. We can't just go through the motions. This is our chance to make an impact, to show Dr. Hayes and everyone else that we understand the weight of this topic. Jake raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. The rest of the group seemed to warm up to the idea, and the meeting quickly became more focused. They broke down the project into manageable sections, each of them agreeing to bring their own ideas and perspectives to the table. Alicia felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had expected more resistance, but now the group was coming together, slowly but surely. She knew that this project was her chance to prove that a group of determined, passionate individuals, no matter their background, could achieve something extraordinary. The weeks that followed were filled with research, late nights in the library, and countless hours of debate. Alicia found herself taking the lead more often than she had expected, not because she wanted to be the boss, but because she realized that her voice was needed. Her team began to see that she wasn't just another student trying to coast through her college years. She was someone who truly believed in the power of education and the responsibility it carried. Her convictions were contagious, and slowly her teammates began to match her level of commitment. Mia, in particular, became a close ally throughout the process. They spent hours discussing how to frame their arguments, how to draw on their own experiences and those of their communities, and how to present their findings in a way that would challenge their peers. Alicia knew that if she wanted to change the world, it had to start with small actions. Actions like this, where she used her knowledge and her voice to spark a conversation that could lead to something bigger. The night before the presentation, the group gathered one last time in the library. The project was complete, their slides were ready, and Alicia felt a sense of pride that was hard to put into words. She looked around the table at her teammates, at Jake, who had put in the work even if he hadn't always shown it, at Mia, who had been her rock throughout the entire process, and at the others, who had all contributed in their own way. They had done something incredible together. "I'm proud of us," Alicia said, her voice full of gratitude. "We've put our hearts into this. No matter what happens tomorrow, we've done our best." Mia smiled, her eyes sparkling with the same excitement Alicia felt. "I have a feeling this is going to be big. We're about to make an impact, Alicia. I can feel it." The next day, the classroom was packed. Dr. Hayes stood at the front, his arms crossed as he surveyed the students, waiting for the presentations to begin. Alicia felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach, but they were different from the fear she had felt in the past. These were the nerves of anticipation, of knowing that they had something important to share. When it was their turn, Alicia stood at the front of the class with Mia beside her, ready to present. Jake and the others stood behind them, supporting the message they were about to deliver. Alicia took a deep breath and began. "Good afternoon, everyone," she started, her voice steady and confident. "Today, we're going to talk about the intersections of race, class, and politics in America. This is a conversation that's long overdue, and we hope to leave you with not just new information, but with the motivation to ask difficult questions and challenge your own perspectives." As Alicia spoke, she could feel the energy in the room change. She wasn't just reading from slides or reciting facts. She was telling a story. She was weaving together history, theory, and personal experience, drawing on everything she had learned, everything she had lived. And in that moment, it wasn't just about her project or her team. It was about something much bigger. It was about the way her words could resonate with others, about the way she could challenge the very systems that sought to silence voices like hers. By the time the presentation was over, the room was eerily quiet. Dr. Hayes stood, his expression unreadable, as he gestured for the class to offer feedback. Alicia's heart raced, but she knew in that moment that it didn't matter what the professor thought. What mattered was that they had said what needed to be said. After a few moments, Dr. Hayes finally spoke. "That was exceptional," he said slowly, his eyes scanning the group. You've not only demonstrated a deep understanding of the material, but you've also shown that you're capable of critical thinking and social awareness. This is exactly what I hope to see in my students." Alicia's heart soared. She glanced at Mia, who was grinning from ear to ear. They had done it. They had succeeded, not just in getting a good grade, but in making a difference. The conversation had begun, and Alicia knew it was just the beginning. As the class dispersed, Alicia walked out of the room with Mia by her side, the weight of the last few weeks finally lifting from her shoulders. She had always believed in herself, but now, more than ever, she knew that belief was no longer just a quiet hope. It was a force to be reckoned with. And as she stepped out into the sunlight, ready to face whatever came next, Alicia knew one thing for certain: nothing was impossible. The world was waiting for her to make her mark, and she was ready to rise.